This wall is shown to millions of tourists as an ancient wonder of the world. But what if its most famous section is hiding a completely different story? Are you sure the Great Wall of China was built only to protect the country from nomads? Are you sure the stone towers in the mountains north of Beijing have stood there since deep antiquity? Are you sure you are looking at a true trace of thousand-year-old defense and not a carefully polished historical showcase? Today we are going to examine a mystery that tour guides speak about far too cautiously. Why did the most famous section of the wall appear exactly in the mountains, where nature itself had already created an almost impassable barrier? Why was it necessary to drag a heavy stone line across the ridges if any enemy would already have had to struggle through dangerous passes? And why are there so many strange questions around Badaling? Questions that no one seems eager to answer directly. For decades we were told a beautiful version. Ancient China, northern hordes, a grand defense system, 20,000 kilometers of stone and earth. It sounds powerful. It sounds familiar. But once you remove the tourist shine, the postcards, the restored towers, and the loud phrases, a completely different picture begins to appear. Masonry that looks too fresh. A location that seems too convenient. A strange silence in old sources. Too many coincidences around a wall that has become a symbol of China. While asking the most dangerous question of all, who built this section, when and why? Watch this episode until the end, because next we will examine not a postcard for tourists, but a real stone mystery. One where the ancient legend may turn out to be far less solid than the wall itself. The official version sounds beautiful and convenient. The Great Wall of China began to be built as early as 300 years before the new era. Then it was expanded, reinforced, rebuilt, and supposedly turned into a gigantic defensive line stretching for more than 20,000 kilometers. From the Yellow Sea in the east to the Mongolian deserts in the west. A stone shield of civilization against the chaos of the steppe. But the louder this version sounds, the stronger the urge to ask, wasn't all of this explained a little too smoothly? We are told that the wall was needed against nomads, against fast mounted units, against raids, against the northern steppes from which danger had been coming for centuries. On paper, everything looks convincing. There is an empire, there is an enemy, there is a border, there is a wall. But history is rarely as neat as a school diagram on a blackboard. Especially when we are talking about a structure that supposedly stretched across mountains, plains, deserts, valleys, and regions where the landscape itself was already a brutal obstacle. This is where the first crack appears. If the main purpose was military, why are the most famous stone sections of the wall today located not where it would have been most practical to stop an army, but where it is most convenient for a tourist to take a majestic photograph? Why, in the public imagination, is the Great Wall of China first of all a toothed stone line running along mountain ridges, and not real border fortifications placed on dangerous roads, plains, and passes? Why are we shown exactly this image? High, dramatic, almost theatrical. This applies to the most popular image of the Great Wall. Stone, towers, steep mountain climbs, and a perfect postcard panorama. But if you remove the tourist admiration and look at it coldly, without bowing before the legend, a blunt question appears. Why build a multi-kilometer stone wall where an enemy would already have had to climb exhausting slopes, lose speed, stretch out their forces, and expose themselves to attack from above? Nomads were dangerous not because they moved beautifully and slowly. Their strength was speed, surprise, and maneuver. Cavalry struck where it could move quickly, hit sharply, and disappear before the main forces arrived. Now imagine a mountain section of the wall, steep climbs, narrow passages, mountain passes, ridges. Is this really the ideal place for a swift cavalry invasion? Was it really there that a massive stone line had to be built, if nature itself was already acting as a heavy defensive machine? And there is another uncomfortable detail. If the wall truly was one gigantic defensive monster stretching for 20,000 kilometers, where is that continuous power? Why do we see majestic stone sections in some places and in others only weak earthworks, traces on the ground, and disputed fragments that archaeologists still have to search for? Why does the grand legend speak of almost unbreakable protection, while reality often shows remains that are difficult to call a serious fortress? The official version demands that the viewer believe in a simple formula. China built the wall to stop the northern hordes. But once you move closer to the details, that formula begins to shake. Stopping raids along more than 20,000 kilometers is an almost insane task. Such a line would require garrisons, supplies, roads, a signal system, constant repairs, discipline, and enormous resources. And not in one place, but across a space stretching from the sea to the deserts. It sounds like imperial power, but it also sounds like an unbearable nightmare. This does not apply to the existence of ancient walls and fortifications themselves. No one is denying that long defensive and border structures were built on Chinese territory. The question is different. Were they really the same single wall that we are used to seeing as the perfect symbol of defense? And was the famous mountain section originally part of that ancient defensive logic? The most suspicious part begins where the convenient version collides with the actual landscape. High mountains north of Beijing, stone ridges, massive walls running along the crests, tourist shine, and next to it, one simple question that makes the whole beautiful picture uncomfortable. Who exactly decided that such a wall was needed there? Not a tower on a disputed mountain pass, not a small fortress by a road, not a fortified post, but a long, heavy, demonstrative stone line. And if the answer again is for protection against nomads, then the question must be asked even more sharply. Which nomads exactly? On which specific route? Why did they have to be stopped in a place where the terrain itself already turned movement into torment? And why did this explanation so conveniently match the image of the wall that later became the main face of Chinese tourism? Too many questions for one simple legend. Too much stone where watchtowers would have been enough. Too much grandeur around a section whose purpose does not become clearer from loud phrases about ancient defense. And the more insistently we are told that the Great Wall of China was built against nomads, the stronger the need to look at it not as a postcard, but with the cold suspicion of someone tired of beautiful tales dressed up as history. Here it must be said plainly, I have never been to China, and I have never seen the Great Wall of China with my own eyes. I have not stood on its towers, touched its stonework with my hand, or looked from the ridge at the endless curves of the wall that are so often shown in travel films. And that is exactly why I'm not going to pretend to be an eyewitness where I was not one. But does an uncomfortable question really require a plane ticket, a tour guide, and the repetition of whatever is written on a tourist sign? Some things become strange, not on the spot, but in documents, in testimonies, in contradictions, and in details that are usually thrown out of the official picture. I have often heard stories from people who saw the wall with their own eyes. Among them were not only tourists who came for a beautiful photograph, but also people with a research interest. People who looked not at souvenirs, but at the landscape, the masonry, the roots, the condition of the sections, and the logic of the structure itself. And in those conversations, one uncomfortable thought kept appearing. The Great Wall is far more complicated than the simple explanations suggest. This applies not to the pretty legend of a stone wonder of the world, but to the real question of the purpose of one specific section. When a person comes to the wall as a tourist, he sees greatness. When he looks more carefully, questions begin to appear. Why does one section look like a carefully prepared showcase? Why does another, less visited section seem to fall out of the familiar ancient picture? Why are the loudest explanations so often the most general ones? I studied this question not as an academic from a university department, but as someone tired of smooth answers to rough historical questions. Documents, descriptions, old versions, eyewitness accounts, maps, disputes around separate sections, all of this gradually formed one uncomfortable picture. Yes, one can accept the official version and stop thinking about it. But then one must pretend that the strange mountain section does not exist. The section that forces the question, who built it, when exactly, and why? The most convenient explanation always sounds confident. The wall protected China from nomads. But confidence is not proof, especially when we are talking about a structure that in some places looks like a powerful stone fortress, and in others, like the remains of earth lines that have lost any military appearance. When such differences are too easily blamed on time, weather, and antiquity, suspicion appears. Is another, far more uncomfortable story hiding behind this simple answer? This applies to the very moment when an amateur investigation can sometimes be more useful than a lifeless retelling of an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia says the wall existed. A guidebook says where to go and where to take pictures. A tourist sign says what to admire. But no one is rushing to explain why the famous mountain section looks as if its meaning is much darker than ordinary protection from steppe raids. That is exactly how I came across the main strange detail. Not a fantastic tale, not a cheap sensation for a loud headline, but a question that stubbornly refuses to disappear. If the mountains themselves were a natural obstacle, why was a massive wall needed there? If the border could be controlled by towers and fortified posts on the passes, why build a demonstrative stone line along the ridges? If the object was truly ancient and important, why are some parts of its history surrounded by so many late, vague, and contradictory explanations? I am not claiming that one person sitting at a desk can erase the entire history of the Great Wall of China in one stroke. But I am saying something else. When a version rests more on habit than on a clear answer, it must be shaken. Hard. Without respectful bows. Because history turned into a tourist poster too often loses the most important thing, the uncomfortable questions from which a real investigation begins. This applies to the way we should look at Badaling and other famous sections of the wall. Not as a postcard, not as a mandatory stop on an excursion, not as a sacred symbol that must not be disturbed by doubt, but as an object where every tower, every climb, every restored fragment, and every abandoned piece of masonry demands one simple, almost brutal explanation. Why was all of this done exactly here? And the more you look at this question without tourist admiration, the sharper the main problem becomes. The official version likes to speak about millennia, empires, and nomads. It likes large numbers, grand formulas, and majestic panoramas. But when it comes to one specific mountain section, the answer suddenly becomes blurry. Defense? Border? Symbol? Late reconstruction? Political gesture? Or something people preferred to describe cautiously and vaguely? That is why this subject requires not worship of antiquity, but a cold interrogation of the facts. Do not believe something just because the object is famous. Do not accept an explanation just because it has been repeated for decades. And do not confuse the scale of a structure with the clarity of its purpose. The Great Wall of China is too large to take its history as a ready-made postcard, especially where the most beautiful view may turn out to be the most convenient mask. The historical background looks monumental and almost flawless at first glance. The Great Wall of China is usually traced back to deep antiquity, to eras when China was not yet the unified state people later became used to seeing on maps. It is commonly said that the first large-scale fortifications began to appear roughly 300 years before the new era, and that later different rulers, dynasties, and states expanded them, connected them, rebuilt them, and strengthened them. This is how the familiar picture was born, as if we are looking not at separate walls and earthworks from different periods, but at one great stone organism that grew for centuries along China's northern border. According to the official version, the task was clear: to separate agricultural China from the nomadic world. On one side, there were cities, fields, officials, imperial authority, taxes, and written orders. On the other side, there was the steppe, cavalry, sudden raids, and tribes that did not stay in one place and did not recognize convenient borders drawn on paper. This picture sounds powerful: civilization against chaos, stone against horsemen, empire against the steppe. But these beautiful schemes are exactly what demand the harshest interrogation. This applies to the very foundation of the familiar explanation. Tell the viewer, the wall protected China from nomads, and everything seems simple. But add more than 20,000 kilometers, and that simplicity immediately turns into a heavy question. How do you control such a line? How do you supply the garrisons? How do you maintain communication? How do you move troops quickly if the threat can appear not in one place, but anywhere? From the eastern regions near the Yellow Sea to the western desert frontiers. We are asked to believe that this was a gigantic defensive system stretching from the Yellow Sea in the east to the Mongolian deserts in the west. It sounds grand, almost imperial, but grandeur by itself does not prove military effectiveness. A long wall without people, roads, supplies, signal posts, and constant repairs turns not into protection, but into an expensive monument to its own arrogance. Nomads were not slow infantrymen obliged to march honestly straight towards stone battlements. Their strength was speed, maneuver, and the ability to choose a weak point. They could bypass a section, strike suddenly, scatter across the steppe, find a passage, use guides, and wait for the right moment. Against such an enemy, a wall alone does not solve the problem. It can delay, it can mark a boundary, it can become a psychological symbol. But to imagine it as an absolute shield across 20,000 kilometers is no longer history. It is an overly convenient legend. This applies to the difference between a real border system and a beautiful image from a travel brochure. A real border is not just stone. It is people, storehouses, signal fires, guards, roads, orders, punishments, repair work, and constant anxiety. And if you remove all of that and leave only a majestic line on a map, what remains is not an explanation, but a poster. The claim that the wall somehow protected China very well sounds especially suspicious. If it protected China so well, why did raids continue? Why did China's northern border remain a problem for centuries? Why did nomadic and semi-nomadic forces repeatedly influence the fate of Chinese states? Why is the history of the region not the history of a peaceful country behind an unbreakable wall, but a history of constant struggle, alliances, campaigns, incursions, deals, tribute, diplomacy, and brutal shifts of power? Here it is important to separate fact from label. The fact is that long fortifications, earthworks, walls, towers, and borderlines from different periods really did exist on Chinese territory. But the label says more, as if all of this was one single plan, one great defensive machine, one continuous stone barrier against the steppe. And at this point, a dangerous confusion begins. Different structures from different eras are easy to merge into one legend when the viewer wants not a complicated history, but a powerful symbol. This applies both to dates and to distances. When you hear 300 years before the new era, you feel antiquity. When you hear 2,000 years of construction, you feel grandeur. When you hear 20,000 kilometers, your imagination draws an almost inhuman scale. But numbers can do more than explain. They can blind, if behind them we no longer see the main question. What exactly was built? Where exactly was it built? At what time? and for what specific purpose. That is why the historical background is needed, not to bow before the familiar version, but to expose its weak spot. Yes, ancient rulers could build fortifications. Yes, the northern danger was real. Yes, the steppe truly pressed against China for centuries. But none of this automatically means that every famous section of the Great Wall was created for the purpose that is now so conveniently repeated in tourist brochures. And the further you look into this story, the stronger the strangeness becomes. If this was defense against nomads, then the main logic should have been military. The wall should have blocked the most dangerous directions, controlled passages, cut off convenient routes, and connected garrisons. But when the most famous image of the Great Wall climbs along mountain ridges, where the terrain itself was already a heavy obstacle, the familiar version begins to sound less like an answer and more like an excuse. Beautiful, loud, but suspiciously incomplete. That is why the question of the Great Wall of China cannot be closed with the phrase, "It was built against nomads." That is too simple for an object stretching through eras, dynasties, peoples, wars, and political myths. 300 years before the new era, one kind of fortification may have appeared. Later, others may have emerged. Still later, they could have been connected, rebuilt, reinterpreted, and presented as part of one ancient line. And that means we are not looking at one wall with one answer, but at a whole knot of structures, versions, and convenient explanations that should have been examined long ago without a respectful fog. If you step away from the postcard image and look at the Great Wall of China, not through the eyes of an excited tourist, but through the eyes of someone asking uncomfortable questions, the picture becomes far less ceremonial. In the public imagination, it is a continuous stone ribbon crawling fiercely across mountains, steppes, and deserts. But reality, as often happens, is much rougher and far less convenient. Across vast stretches, what remains of this legendary line is not majestic stonework, but scattered traces, earth mounds, ruined fragments, and sections that, without a specialist pointing them out, you might not even recognize as military structures. And this is where the real problem begins for the beautiful version. If this was a single powerful defensive system, why does most of it not look like a fortress? Why do we often find low earthworks instead of a continuous stone barrier, worn down by time, wind, and soil? Why does the main image of the wall rest on a few spectacular sections that are convenient to show, convenient to film, and convenient for the tourist legend? This applies to the sharpest contrast between image and fact. The image says, "This is China's stone shield." The fact shows, in many places, it looks more like the trace of old borders, earth lines, and ruined fortifications than one continuous war machine. And the longer you look at this gap, the stronger the question becomes. Has a complicated history been replaced with a convenient picture? The most famous sections of the wall look magnificent. They run along mountain ridges, climb steep peaks, dive into saddles, rise again, and create the very grand view sold to the world as a symbol of ancient Chinese power. But these are exactly the sections that raise the most uncomfortable questions. Because the beauty of a panorama does not prove the military purpose of a structure. Stone on a mountain ridge may impress the viewer, but that does not mean it was the most reasonable answer to the threat of steppe cavalry. Now look at what exists outside these famous fragments. There is no longer the same ceremonial grandeur. There is no endless perfect masonry obediently stretching from horizon to horizon. Instead, there are often earthworks, sunken lines, collapsed mounds, and traces of long-vanished fortifications. And if we call all of that one single continuous fortress wall, then we have to stretch the meaning of the word fortress very far. This does not apply to denying the existence of ancient structures. No one has to argue that China built ramparts, walls, towers, and borderlines. The dispute begins somewhere else. Can all of this honestly be gathered into one legend about a gigantic wall that supposedly protected the empire from northern hordes? Or are we looking at a collection of different structures, built in different eras, for different purposes, and then united under one loud name? If the wall was meant to protect against invasions, it should have stood where the enemy could actually pass. Where there were roads, valleys, passages, convenient routes, water sources, and places where people and horses could move. But when the most famous sections are high in the mountains, a rough, logical crack appears. Why build a heavy stone line where the terrain itself already breaks speed, destroys maneuver, and turns movement into an exhausting climb? And general phrases about the wisdom of ancient builders do not save the situation here. Ancient people were not madmen who simply spent strength on stone, towers, and roads to them for no reason. Any large construction project requires labor, food, tools, organization, protection, time, and orders. If a powerful wall appears somewhere, someone considered it necessary. But necessary for what exactly? That is the question too often hidden behind grandeur. This applies to those very picturesque sections that have now become the face of the entire Great Wall. They are convenient as a symbol, but suspicious as a universal explanation. A tourist sees greatness and takes a photo. A researcher looks at the terrain and asks, where is the main military logic here? A skeptic looks at the preserved sections and asks even more sharply, why are these the ones that survived best, while the huge rest of the line often looks like an almost erased trace on the ground? It is too easy to say that time destroyed everything. Yes, time destroys. Wind, rain, wars, abandonment, lack of repair. All of it could turn a rampart into a barely visible line. But then a new question appears. Why did the most spectacular sections, the ones that today shape the world's idea of the Great Wall, turn out to be so convenient for restoration, display, and admiration? Why did they become the main proof of ancient power when the rest of the picture is much more complicated and much dirtier? A low earthwork does not impress the viewer. It does not sell the legend. It does not look like a wonder of the world. It is difficult to place on a cover, difficult to turn into a symbol of imperial grandeur, difficult to present as an impassable barrier against hordes. But a stone wall on a mountain ridge works perfectly. It immediately strikes the imagination, creates a feeling of ancient strength, and makes people forget the question of why it was built in that place at all. This applies to the main substitution that is rarely spoken aloud. Instead of honestly separating different types of structures, earthworks, borderlines, towers, later fortifications, restored sections, all of it is often merged into one grand image. What we get is not a complex history of construction, but a convenient imperial decoration. And the more beautiful the decoration, the less people want to notice the seams, cracks, and strange inconsistencies. If you look at the Great Wall as a whole, and not only at its ceremonial fragments, it stops being a simple formula from a textbook. Before us is not one stone serpent perfectly created to defend against the northern steppes. Before us is a disputed, multi-layered, sometimes ruined, sometimes restored, sometimes almost vanished complex of structures. And this complex demands not worship, but a section-by-section interrogation. Where was their defense? Where was there a border? Where was their politics? Where was their later reconstruction? And where was there simply a beautiful legend that was too useful to repeat? That is why the question of what actually remains of the wall is dangerous for the official picture. Because it takes away the legend's main advantage, the feeling of unity and continuous power. When, instead of one great fortress, we see different sections, different materials, different conditions, and different questions, the familiar story begins to crumble. The wall itself does not disappear. What disappears is the simple explanation that was presented for too long as the final answer. With ancient maps of the Great Wall of China, a separate and very uncomfortable story begins. Because a map is supposed to bring clarity, but here it too often adds fog. It would seem that if we are dealing with such a colossal structure, if for centuries it was considered China's main northern shield, if its length is measured in tens of thousands of kilometers, then where is the exact line? Where is the iron certainty? Where is the clear route from one end to the other? But instead, we see a strange picture. Sections are still being searched for. They are being clarified. They are compared with ancient schemes, with the remains of ramparts, with archaeological finds, and with the terrain itself. And suddenly it turns out that not everything matches as beautifully as supporters of the simple version would like. In one place, there is a line on the map, but on the ground, almost nothing convincing. In another place, a rampart is found, but not exactly where it was expected to be. This applies to the most painful part of the question. Even the geography of the Great Wall does not look completely closed and undisputed. For a tourist, there is a ready-made route, a ticket office, a bus, and a restored section. For a researcher, there is a much rougher reality. Ruined fragments, disputed traces, conflicting readings, later descriptions, and attempts to understand what exactly lies before him. The remains of an ancient fortification, a border rampart, or part of a completely different system. It is especially curious that modern archaeologists are still searching for lost sections. That fact alone sounds almost scandalous against the loud claims about the Great Wall as a world-famous wonder. How can one search for something that was supposedly the greatest defensive line of antiquity? How can there be disputes about the location of a structure that, according to the textbook version, stretched across half a country? Where was this gigantic stone certainty if today its traces have to be literally pulled out of the ground? Of course, time could have erased a great deal. Earth mounds collapse, brick is taken apart, stone is carried away for household needs. Rain, wind, wars, abandonment, and human indifference all do their work. But this explains the destruction of material. It does not always explain the confusion in the logic of the route itself. If the line was a vital defense, why are its traces so uneven? Why have some sections been turned into a tourist symbol, while others look as if their significance still has to be proven? This does not apply to a minor technical mistake, but to a major historical doubt. When the map, the legend, and the ground under your feet begin to diverge, a dangerous question appears. Were different structures gathered under one name too late and too conveniently? Did old border ramparts, local fortifications, later walls, and restored sections become part of one grand story that is now presented as a single design? Ancient maps themselves are not a final verdict on truth. They could be inaccurate, conditional, schematic. They could be recopied, corrected, decorated, and adjusted to fit the political picture of their time. But precisely for that reason, they must not be turned into a sacred seal after which all questions are forbidden. A map shows the understanding of an era, not always the strict geometry of a real structure. And if archaeology begins to argue with the map, then we are not looking at a clear answer, but at a conflict of sources. What is especially irritating in this story is the ease with which complexity is replaced by a beautiful formula. Here it is, the Great Wall, we are told. Here is its ancient route. Here is its purpose. But when you begin to clarify where exactly individual sections ran, what remains of them, and why some lines do not match the expected places, that confidence quickly loses its armor. Instead of stone straight certainty, a historical mess appears, in which every fragment must be checked separately. This applies to the disappeared sections, which are too important to be treated as a minor detail. If we were talking about a decorative fence, the loss of a few fragments would change nothing. But if we are talking about a military line stretching for thousands of kilometers, every gap becomes a question. Who controlled it? Why did it disappear? Was it ever part of that same wall? Or was it later written into the general scheme, so that the legend would look smoother, longer, and more impressive. And this is exactly where the official picture begins to crack nervously. A real defensive system should be understandable in its military logic. It should show which directions were blocked, which passages were controlled, where the garrisons stood, how signals were transmitted, and how communication between sections was maintained. But when, instead, we see a blurred line that is visible in some places, has to be searched for in others, and does not match expectations in still others, the question is no longer academic. It is direct and brutal. What exactly are we being shown under the name of the Great Wall? And the more such inconsistencies appear, the harder it becomes to believe in the image of one single monolithic barrier. Perhaps different ramparts really did mark borders. Perhaps certain sections defended specific passages. Perhaps some fragments were completed in later eras. Perhaps part of the structures received a new meaning only after the old political map had disappeared. But then one unpleasant thing must be admitted. Before us is not a simple story about an ancient wall against nomads, but a multi-layered construction made of different eras, different tasks, and different explanations. With the disappeared sections, the problem becomes especially sharp. They seem to cut pieces of certainty out of the familiar legend. Where there should be a clear line, guesses appear. Where you expect powerful masonry, there remains an unclear rampart. Where the map promises continuation, the landscape does not always confirm it convincingly. And this is no minor nitpicking. It is a blow to the most convenient myth that the Great Wall of China was always understandable, whole, and obvious. That is why ancient maps in this story do not work as a closing document, but as a source of new questions. They do not put a full stop, they open a dispute. And if China's greatest structure has to be searched for through fragments, checked against doubtful lines, and explained through inconsistencies, then we are not looking at museum clarity, but at a dark archive where too many pages have been glued together, torn out, or rewritten by someone else's hand. And this is where a version appears that sounds far more ordinary, but far more dangerous for the familiar legend. What if a significant part of the ancient ramparts was not built as a shield against nomads at all? What if we are looking not at a grand military machine, but at a rough, heavy earthen line of ownership? Not a fortress against the steppe, but a border between states, principalities, regions, and rulers who wanted to secure their claim to land, not with words, but with a rampart. In the ancient world, a border was not a thin red line on an accurate map. Maps were conditional, disputed, inaccurate, and sometimes completely useless for the real control of land. One ruler could claim one thing, the neighboring ruler another, and between them lay fields, roads, pastures, rivers, hills, and villages. And then a rampart appeared, not necessarily high, not necessarily stone, but visible, heavy, stubborn. It could not be quietly erased with a pen like a line on paper. This applies to the simple logic that is too often pushed aside by loud phrases about great defense. A rampart could speak without translation. Here one power ends and another begins. Here the boundary cannot simply be moved. Here the dispute is no longer solved by quietly editing a document because the land itself has been marked with an embankment, a ditch, a tower, or a line of fortification. This explanation does not look as spectacular as the legend of a stone shield against hordes. It does not look as beautiful in a travel film. It does not create instant grandeur, but it explains the strange nature of ancient long ramparts much better. If the task was not to stop thousands of mounted warriors, but to mark a boundary between territories, then even a low earthen line suddenly makes sense. It does not have to be impassable, it has to be visible. That is the rough, almost everyday strength of this version. A border on a map can be moved. A document can be rewritten. Future generations can be convinced that it had always been this way. But moving a multi-kilometer rampart is a completely different matter. It requires people, time, noise, traces, expense, and scandal. A rampart is too visible to be stolen overnight, like a line in an archive paper. This applies not only to China, but to the very nature of ancient power. A state always wants to see its edges. An official wants to know where taxes must be collected. A military commander wants to understand where foreign territory begins. A farmer wants to know which land he is responsible for. And if there are no precise instruments, no modern geodesy, no unified map, then an earthen rampart becomes a primitive but powerful document on the ground. Then the disappeared and ruined sections receive a new explanation. When states united, old internal borders became unnecessary. Yesterday, a rampart separated two rivals. Tomorrow, both were inside one larger authority. Why repair it? Why keep people there? Why preserve a line that no longer decides anything? It became overgrown, collapsed, washed out by rains and winds, and turned into a vague trace that, centuries later, archaeologists would search for with a ruler, a shovel, and doubt. And that is why the picture of the Great Wall may be far more complicated than the simple tale about protection from nomads. Some sections could have been real military fortifications. Others could have been border ramparts between neighboring states. Others could have been later additions. Still others could have been restored symbols that were given an ancient meaning afterward. And all of this was conveniently covered with one loud name, so that no one would have to explain the dirty, complicated, contradictory history to the viewer. This applies to the most dangerous thought. The Great Wall of China may not have been one structure with one purpose, but a huge collection of different lines built in different centuries for different tasks. Somewhere, people really feared raids. Somewhere, they fixed a border. Somewhere, they demonstrated power. Somewhere, they built not so much against an enemy as for their own subjects, so that everyone could see where the command of the state began and ended. If we accept this version, many things fall into place. Low earthen ramparts no longer look like pathetic remains of a failed fortress. They become what they may have been from the beginning: boundary markers, harsh land divisions, political scars on the body of the earth. Their task was not to survive an assault, but to stop a dispute. Not to throw back cavalry, but to show, beyond this point, another power begins. But then an even harsher question appears. If ancient ramparts could have been borders rather than a continuous defensive line, what should we do with the mountain section north of Beijing? There, nature itself had already placed a boundary. Ridges, passes, steep climbs, dangerous crossings. Why build a massive stone wall in such a place? To mark a border? But the mountains are already visible. For defense? But the terrain is already difficult. For beauty? In ancient politics, beauty rarely justified such expense. This applies to the moment when the alternative version does not close the mystery, but makes it sharper. If ramparts on plains and disputed lands can be explained by border logic, then a wall along mountain ridges becomes even more suspicious. It no longer fits either simple defense or simple land division. It looks like a demonstration, a sign, a late gesture of power that required not only stone but a reason. That is why the border version matters. It does not erase ancient history, but clears it of overly convenient grandeur. It forces us to look at every section separately. Where did a rampart mark a boundary? Where did a wall block a passage? Where did a tower serve as an observation post? And where are we looking at a structure that was later turned into a symbol, even though its real reason still sticks out like a stone from a badly covered pit? And the more calmly you look at this scheme, the louder the main conclusion becomes. Not every long line is a fortress. Not every wall is built against an enemy. Not every ancient rampart has to be heroic defense. Sometimes it is simply the rough signature of power written on the land. But if that is true, then the most famous mountain section of the Great Wall of China demands a separate explanation. And that explanation can no longer be hidden behind the routine phrase about nomads. When a state grows, old borders begin to behave like unnecessary scars. Yesterday they divided rivals. Yesterday people argued over them, placed guards near them, collected duties, and punished trespassers. But then a new power arrives, absorbs its neighbors, unites lands, changes the map, and the former boundary suddenly loses its meaning. The rampart remains, but there is no longer any order to repair it. That is how internal lines could disappear, even if they once seemed important and untouchable. As long as separate domains existed nearby, the border was needed. Once those domains found themselves inside one larger political body, the rampart turned into a useless fold of earth. No one guarded it anymore, reinforced it, cleared it of bushes, or rebuilt it after rain and erosion. This applies to those sections that today look weak, vague, and almost helpless. Not necessarily because they were badly built, but because they may have lost their purpose long before archaeologists began studying them and fitting them into the larger legend of the Great Wall. Power moved farther away, the border shifted, and the old rampart remained in the ground like a forgotten document without a seal. In Chinese history, such changes were not an exception, but a normal mechanism of great politics. Small states argued, fought, united, collapsed, and then again fell under the authority of a stronger center. Where yesterday there was a dividing line, tomorrow there could be an internal road, a field, a settlement, or simply empty land. And if a rampart no longer served the interests of power, it was doomed to slow disappearance. But the northern borders were a completely different matter. Where the agricultural regions ended and the restless world of the steppe began, old lines could survive longer. Not because they were impossible to cross, but because the very idea of an external border remained important. The north was always a direction of pressure, fear, trade, raids, negotiations, and brutal political games. There, a rampart could be not a wall of victory, but a sign of anxiety. This applies to external border lines that may have outlived internal boundaries. An internal border can be forgotten after lands are united. An external frontier is harder to forget, because beyond it begins another force, another world, another threat. But even the most external rampart does not automatically become an impregnable fortress if there is no army, no roads, no signal system, and no constant control behind it. And here the official legend again collides with rough reality. If the northern ramparts truly remained as external frontiers, they could mark the edge of power. They could warn, fix a boundary, direct movement, and show where the zone of control began. But to stop fast nomadic units with one earthen line, that is already too bold a tale, convenient to repeat, but difficult to defend with common sense. Nomads were not obliged to move where they were expected. They could search for weak points, bypass fortifications, use guides, move in small groups, appear suddenly, and disappear just as quickly. A rampart could delay a cart, slow movement, or mark a boundary, but it did not cancel steppe tactics. Against a mobile enemy, you need not only an earthen mound, but an entire system of authority and military reaction. This applies to the main mistake in how the wall is perceived. It is often imagined as an object, while defense is actually a process. A wall does not fight by itself. A rampart does not see the enemy by itself. A tower without people is just empty stone. If there is no garrison, no supply, and no order at the frontier, even the most terrifying line becomes a decoration. That is why the disappearance of old sections can be explained without mysticism and without cheap miracles. The political map changed, and some borders became unnecessary. Power grew larger, and old cordons dissolved inside new territories. Trade routes shifted, people moved away, roads changed, and structures that had meaning yesterday turned into a useless burden. But this explanation strikes the beautiful image of one ancient wall. If different sections disappeared for different reasons, if some ramparts were internal borders, others external frontiers, and still others later fortifications, then before us is no longer a simple stone line against northern hordes. Before us is a heavy archive of the land, where every section demands its own interrogation. Where was politics? Where was defense? Where was a border? Where was a later addition? This also applies to the very idea of what survived. What survives is not always what is oldest. What survives is what was destroyed less, maintained more often, placed more successfully, displayed more profitably, or restored later. Sometimes the object that looks best is not the oldest one, but the one that remained useful to power longer, or became useful for a new legend. And if you look at the Great Wall of China this way, its ruined sections stop being annoying exceptions. They become clues. They speak of shifting borders, forgotten frontiers, vanished political lines, and states that once fought over land before dissolving into a larger authority. This is not a romantic ruin. It is a rough trace of administrative struggle, left directly on the body of the country. The most important point is this: old borders disappeared not because history was weak, but because power changed shape. When one center absorbed several regions, the former dividing lines became unnecessary. When an external enemy stopped being the main fear in a specific direction, fortifications were abandoned. When a route lost its importance, a tower turned into an empty observation post without observers. This applies to the northern ramparts, which may have survived longer than the others, but still did not deliver the result that the beautiful legend attributes to them. They could mark the edge of the state, but they could not lock the step shut. They could show where foreign space began, but they could not guarantee safety. They could be a symbol of order, but a symbol does not stop cavalry if there is no living force behind it. And after all this, it becomes even harder to explain the mountain wall north of Beijing. If internal ramparts disappeared because states grew larger, that is understandable. If external lines remained as border markers, that can also be accepted. But why, in that case, build a massive stone line along the ridges where nature itself already plays the role of a border? Here, the usual explanation falls into a pit again. Old borders could disappear because they were no longer needed. Northern ramparts could remain because they marked the anxious edge of the state. But the mountain section, now turned into a symbol of the Great Wall, demands a harsher answer. It does not look like a random remnant of an internal boundary. It does not look like an ordinary earthen marker. It is too demonstrative, too spectacular, too conveniently fitted into the image of a great ancient wall, not to ask, who needed exactly this kind of stone sign in exactly this place, and why? Now the entire dispute comes down to one section, and it looks far too spectacular to be accidental. North of Beijing, among mountain ridges and heavy passes, stands the very wall that millions of people are used to seeing as the face of all Chinese antiquity. Stone runs along the peaks, towers cling to the crests, and the line rises and falls like a gigantic decoration of power. But the closer you look at this section, the harsher the question becomes. Why build a massive wall where nature itself had already placed a barrier? Mountains are not a plain where cavalry can move quickly. They are not an open steppe where a unit appears suddenly, strikes hard, and disappears beyond the horizon. Mountains force people to move slowly. They break formation, stretch out troops, drain strength, narrow the passages, and turn every climb into a trial. If defense is needed, it is enough to hold the passes, control the roads, place towers at key points, and watch the movement below. This applies to the main logical whole in the entire familiar version. On a plain, a wall can still look understandable. It cuts the space, delays movement, directs the flow of people toward gates and posts. But on a mountain ridge, the situation is different. There, the land itself already works as a fortification. There, every slope, every rocky climb, every narrow passage already becomes a natural defense. And yet, someone decided to build there, not separate watchtowers, not small fortresses on disputed passes, not fortified points near roads, but a long, heavy, demonstrative wall. That no longer looks like simple practicality. It looks like an order with a special reason behind it. A reason expensive, difficult, and still not honestly explained. After all, a wall in the mountains is not just masonry. It means transporting materials. It means workers. It means tools. It means food. It means protection. It means roads to the construction site. It means towers, stairs, passages, repairs and control. Someone had to organize all of this, pay for it, and force it to be done. And for what? To strengthen mountains that were already stronger than any embankment. This applies to the question of cost and purpose. Ancient and later rulers could be cruel, authoritarian, ambitious, but they were not madmen who built gigantic structures simply for a beautiful view. If a massive stone line appeared along the ridges, then someone needed it. Not in general, not symbolically, not for a schoolbook legend, but in a specific political or military situation. But if this was defense against nomads, then where is the root of such an attack? What cavalry was supposed to climb over these ridges, losing speed and its main advantage? What units were supposed to storm the heights, where a defender only had to occupy a tower and control the passage? Why not block specific roads and gorges, but instead drag a wall across the peaks, as if the main goal was not to stop an enemy, but to display a grand line of power? Here the official explanation begins to sound especially weak. It repeats, protection from nomads. But that phrase is too general. It does not answer the question of the specific place. It does not explain why this particular mountain section became so powerful and so famous. It does not explain why the natural border was duplicated in stone. This applies to the difference between a real answer and a convenient label. A real answer must explain the terrain, the route, the time of construction, the purpose of the towers, the logic of the garrisons, and the meaning of the expense. A convenient label simply says, this was how they defended themselves from the northern threat. But the northern threat is not a magic spell that can cover every architectural oddity. If the wall was meant to mark a border, the question does not disappear either. Mountains are already borders. They can be seen from far away. They are difficult to cross. They divide territories naturally, without bricks and battlements. In disputed places, border towers could have been placed, passes could have been fortified, checkpoints could have been built, but constructing a stone line along the whole ridge is too heavy a solution for a simple mark on the ground. Then an unpleasant thought remains. Perhaps this section was needed not where and not for what we are told. Perhaps its meaning was connected not with ancient defense against the steppe, but with a later demonstration of power. Perhaps it was meant not so much to stop an enemy as to create a visible sign. Here runs the border of order. Here power leaves its stone signature. Here begins a territory that must be perceived as ancient, strong, and untouchable. This applies to the very image of the wall north of Beijing. It works too well as a symbol. It lies too expressively across the mountains. It looks too conveniently dramatic against the sky. It does not merely block a passage, it creates an impression. And when a structure creates a stronger impression than it explains its practical purpose, one must ask the question with special force, are we looking at a fortress or at a political decoration? The main mystery is exactly this. If the wall stood only in valleys and along routes of movement, there would be fewer questions. If it blocked convenient roads, everything would look clearer. If it consisted of separate towers on mountain passes, its purpose could be explained without unnecessary noise. But a massive line on mountain ridges demands a different answer. Not a tourist answer, not a schoolbook answer, not one convenient for a brochure. And the more strongly this section is turned into a symbol of antiquity, the louder the question of its true origin becomes. Who decided to build there, where smaller measures would have been enough? Who considered it necessary to make the wall not just useful, but majestic? Who turned harsh mountains into a stone showcase of power? And why did this strange mountain section become the main face of the Great Wall of China? Here, general phrases no longer work. The mountains north of Beijing do not resemble an empty plain that urgently needed to be closed off from cavalry. Passes do not require a continuous wall on every ridge. The natural terrain itself dictates the defensive logic. Hold the passages, watch the roads, control the narrow places. But before us is not only control, before us is demonstration. And that is why the wall in the mountains becomes not an answer, but evidence. It does not remove the question of its purpose. On the contrary, it makes it sharper. It seems to say, I was built for a reason, but for too long you were told a version that was too simple. And until there is an honest answer to why such a heavy stone line was needed, where nature itself was already a wall, the mystery of the Great Wall of China remains open. To understand why the mountain section of the wall raises so many questions, we have to step away from the familiar image of towers and tourists and look at the 17th century. That is where the dirty political turn begins, without which the story of Badaling remains incomplete. In the middle of the 17th century, China fell into the hands of a force often called the Manchus. But behind that name was not a simple steppe crowd, but a far more complicated historical mixture. The Manchus were not ordinary nomads from a cheap schoolbook scheme. They cannot simply be placed in the same row as some faceless northern threat from which the ancient wall supposedly saved China. In their origin, culture, and political experience, there was a heavy trace of the Khitans, a people who had their own state tradition as early as the end of the first millennium of the new era. It was the Khitans who created the Liao state, and that was no tent in the middle of the steppe. It was real power, an army, administration, diplomacy, and the memory of serious politics. This applies to an important detail that is too often swallowed without explanation. If a people has experience in building a state, it thinks not only in terms of raids and plunder, it thinks in terms of borders, roads, taxes, officials, capitals, and symbols of power. That is why the Manchu trace in Chinese history cannot be reduced to the crude formula, "Northerners came and captured the country." Everything was harsher, smarter, and more dangerous. The Khitans were also well known from the Russian side of the historical horizon. The Russian name for China is linked to them. Russians called the Khitans Kitai, and that word became so firmly rooted that it later passed on to the enormous country the Manchus subdued in 1644. Such is the irony of history. The Russian word for China is connected not with the Chinese people's own name, but with the memory of a people who came from the northeastern edge of the political map. In 1644, the Manchus entered Beijing and founded the Qing dynasty. And here a hard line must be drawn immediately. This was not the ancient Qin Empire that existed before the new era. This was a different power, a different period, a different political situation. Confusion between the names is convenient for a shallow retelling, but dangerous for understanding. Qin was an ancient empire. Qing was the Manchu dynasty that ruled China in a completely different historical age. This applies to the most nervous point of the whole version. If the mountain section of the wall really belongs to a later period, then we must look not only at ancient builders, but also at those who received China in the 17th century and began to rebuild it for themselves. The Manchus came not simply as outside conquerors. They received a huge country exhausted by internal conflicts, fragmentation, elite struggles, and a crisis of the old power. And here an especially important motive appears. The Manchus did not create an entirely new state from nothing. They took China as a ready-made machine of power and began to modernize it, adapt it, strengthen it, and use it. It was a pragmatic and cold move. Why break a huge mechanism if you can sit at its center, replace the masters, rewrite the rules, and force the old system to work for a new dynasty? In this logic, walls, borders, and symbols receive a completely different meaning. A new power always needs not only an army, but also signs of legitimacy. It has to show, we are here not temporarily, not accidentally, not as raiders, but as the masters of a vast historical space. And if old borders need to be restored, emphasized, or reinterpreted for that purpose, power will do it without sentiment. This applies to the question of why the disputed section north of Beijing fits so poorly into the simple ancient scheme. If we look only at the era before the new era, many things do not come together. But if we shift our view to the period of Manchu rule, a new layer appears. Before us may be not simply a defense against nomads, but a possible sign of later state demonstration. Stone placed where it was necessary to show strength, order, and historical depth. The Manchus had the experience of northern peoples, but they ruled through the Chinese state shell. That double position was explosive in itself. On one side, they were an outside force in relation to the old Chinese elite. On the other side, they needed to look like legitimate emperors of China, continuers of order, guardians of borders, and heirs to ancient power. In such a situation, the wall could become not only a military object, but a political language. And if, against this background, a majestic line appears in the mountains, the question becomes even sharper. Was it ancient defense, or a later sign of power that was then conveniently written into the legend of a 1,000-year-old wall? Was it a real military necessity, or a stone declaration? The new dynasty controls the north, Beijing, the passes, and the very memory of the border. This applies not to fantasy, but to the logic of power. Every dynasty tries to rewrite space for itself. Some build palaces, others raise fortresses. Still others restore old symbols in order to look more ancient, stronger, and more legitimate. The Manchu Qing received China at a moment of heavy restructuring, and that is why the question of walls, frontiers, and demonstrative structures becomes not secondary but central. That is why the history of the Manchus, the Khitans, Liao, and the Qing dynasty is needed not for a dry reference note. It shows that behind the stones there may have been not only ancient fears of the steppe, but also later politics of power. And if the most famous mountain section of the wall was indeed connected with the age when China was already under Manchu rule, then the familiar tourist phrase about protection from nomads becomes too poor, too smooth, too convenient. The question is no longer whether walls were built in China at all. They were. The question is different. Who exactly built the specific mountain section that is shown today as the face of the entire ancient wall? Ancient Chinese rulers fighting northern tribes? Or a later power that needed a stone symbol of control over the northern gates of Beijing? And if even the second option is partly true, then we are not looking simply at architecture. We are looking at a political operation sealed in stone. And this is where the most uncomfortable part of the whole story begins. The Manchus took control of China, entered Beijing, founded the Qing dynasty, launched their own system of rule, subdued a vast country, and began rebuilding it for themselves. The new power did not simply sit on the throne and admire ancient walls. It brought the empire into order, strengthened borders, held the elites under control, changed old rules, and built a new political framework. And against this background, the silence surrounding the mountain section of the Great Wall does not look merely strange. It sounds suspiciously loud. If this was a crucial ancient defensive section north of Beijing, why does it not appear as a first-rank object in stories about power, borders, and security? Why did the Manchu dynasty, which understood perfectly well the meaning of northern frontiers, leave no clear, loud, convincing trace around this mountain wall? Why does such an object seem to fall out of the familiar historical chain and appear in the field of view too late, when China was already becoming an arena for foreign pressure? This applies to the most dangerous detail. The important object exists, the stone stands, the towers are visible, the line in the mountains impresses, but around it, the chronicles seem to contain a gap. Not a small crack, not a minor inaccuracy, a real emptiness. And if the wall truly was an ancient strategic shield, then this emptiness demands an explanation. Not a pretty phrase for tourists, but a harsh answer. Who was silent? Why were they silent? And what exactly did they not want or fail to record? This strangeness becomes especially sharp against the background of the early 20th century. By that time, China had been weakened, pressed by foreign influence, and torn apart by the interests of world powers. After foreign intervention, the country began to be divided into spheres of influence. Britain, France, the United States, Russia, and other players no longer looked at Chinese territory as distant, exotic land, but as prey, a market, a foothold, and a zone of control. And it was precisely in this alarming period that the very mountain section that is now treated as the ancient face of the Great Wall suddenly emerged. The very fact of such a late appearance in public history cuts the ear. Is it really possible to imagine that such a significant section of a great structure remained almost in the shadows for centuries and then was discovered almost by accident? Is it possible to calmly accept the version that a stone line in impassable mountains, not far from the direction of Beijing, waited for its moment until the beginning of the 20th century? If the object was truly so important, why was it not part of the constant political and historical conversation much earlier? This applies not to some ordinary forgotten stone on the outskirts, but to a section that would later become a tourist symbol. Today, millions know Badaling. It is shown as one of the main entrances into the myth of the Great Wall of China. And that is exactly why the question sounds even harsher. How could an object that became the showcase of antiquity have such a murky line of emergence in the broader historical record? There is a version that the remains of a brick wall high in the mountains were noticed precisely during the period when China was already under heavy external pressure. The issue was not some fantastic thousands of kilometers, but only a few dozen kilometers in difficult mountain terrain. But that was enough for the section to gain a meaning that is now difficult to overestimate. It became not just a fragment of masonry, but an image, a sign, a proof of greatness, a convenient stone formula for the whole world. And here an unpleasant thought appears. Perhaps Badaling became famous not because it was the oldest and most important section, but because it was the most convenient for a new historical showcase. Close to Beijing, a striking landscape, a stone line on the ridges, towers that look perfect against the sky. A tourist does not need to understand the complicated history of ramparts, borders, dynasties, and disputed maps. The tourist sees a mountain, a wall, stone, and the legend already works. This applies to the mechanics of a historical symbol. A symbol does not have to be the oldest, it has to be the most visually convincing. It must hit the eyes, the imagination, the sense of scale. And Badaling performs this task brilliantly. It looks exactly the way the Great Wall is supposed to look in the public mind. Grim, beautiful, high, almost theatrical. But if you remove the theatricality, the harsh silence of the sources remains. Why did the Manchu power, which ruled China for several centuries, not place this mountain section at the center of its own historical memory? Why did it not become a permanent argument of power earlier? Why did its fame increase so sharply only in a new era, when antiquities began to be displayed, described, restored, and turned into national symbols? Here the phrase, "they simply forgot," is not enough. Too convenient a forgetting, too successful a later discovery, too strong an object for too weak an explanation. If the section truly had ancient defensive significance, its silence looks strange. But if it is connected with a later political purpose, then everything becomes even sharper. Before us may be not so much an ancient shield against nomads, but a stone seal of later power, later built into a grand legend. This applies to the Manchu trace, which cannot be ignored. The new dynasty received China not in a museum-like state, but at a moment of crisis, struggle, and reconstruction. It needed to govern a vast country, hold the northern gates, demonstrate continuity, prove strength, and tie itself to an ancient tradition. In such conditions, walls and borders become not only military tools, they turn into the language of power. That is why the strange silence around the mountain wall does not look like a minor detail. It resembles a darkened place in a document where the most important line has been covered by someone else's hand. The stone is there, the panorama is there, the tourist image is there, but there is no clear answer as to why this section did not sound so loudly before. And the more Badaling is turned into an unquestionable postcard of antiquity, the stronger the question becomes. Did this postcard appear on the table of history far too late? Silence sometimes speaks louder than a chronicle, especially when what remains silent is not an empty field, but a wall in the mountains north of Beijing. Especially when that very section later becomes the face of a great structure. Especially when Manchu power, foreign pressure in the early 20th century, tourist interest, and a convenient legend about an ancient stone shield all converge around it. Too many coincidences for one simple version. Too much shadow around a wall that today is presented as a symbol of clear and majestic antiquity. Now we have to look not at the legend, but at the masonry itself. Because the most dangerous thing in the story of Badaling is not only the strange silence of the chronicles, but the appearance of the wall. It should be heavy with antiquity, with the scars of time, with the thousand-year fatigue of stone. But instead, an uncomfortable feeling appears. Before us is not the grey wound of ancient eras, but a structure that looks too solid, too neat, too fresh. Yes, the section of the wall near Beijing was carefully restored. This is known, this is visible, and almost no one disputes it. During the era of Mao Zedong, Badaling began to be brought into a ceremonial condition, turning it into the face of the Great Wall of China for the country and for the outside world. Where there should have been a harsh ancient frontier, there appeared a tourist showcase with smooth paths, convenient climbs, and an impressive line of battlements. This applies to the main contrast of Badaling. One part works as an official postcard, while the other tests that postcard for strength. The restored section is easy to explain. It was renewed, cleaned, strengthened, and prepared for crowds of visitors. But it is far more interesting to look where the tour groups usually do not reach, where there is no such shine, where the wall should show its real age. And that is where the sharpest detail begins. Even the abandoned fragments, which do not look like a perfectly cleaned museum route, do not create the impression of deep antiquity. They do not look like a structure that has survived 2,000 years of merciless wind, rain, frost, landslides, and human indifference. They look older than something built yesterday, but not old enough for a genuine stone line supposedly coming from deep antiquity. Of course, one can say that restoration changed everything. One can blame the neatness on repairs, the masonry on later work, the freshness on maintenance. But that only explains the ceremonial section. What about those parts that, according to the author's version, were never truly repaired and where tourist traffic almost never reaches? Why does even there the feeling arise that we are looking not at an ancient giant, but at a relatively late structure. This applies not to taste and not to a personal impression from a beautiful image. This is a question of preservation logic. A truly ancient object, especially in the mountains, does not exist in a vacuum. It is struck by seasonal changes, water, roots, wind, earthquakes, and people who take stone for household use. Over centuries, all of this leaves marks that are difficult to hide behind one general phrase about ancient grandeur. That is why the estimate of 100 to 150 years sounds so provocative. It strikes not only at the age of the masonry, but at the entire tourist legend. If even part of Badaling looks like a structure from a relatively late period, then the familiar formula, an ancient wall against nomads, becomes far too narrow. It no longer explains the appearance. It does not explain the silence. It does not explain why this exact section became the main symbol. Here, the difference between restoration and origin becomes especially important. An ancient object can be restored. An old line can be renewed. A ruin can be put back in order. But if an object did not look deeply ancient even before restoration, then the question becomes harsher. What exactly was restored? An ancient frontier? A later wall? Or a structure that was later given a more respectable age? This applies to the most uncomfortable zone between archaeology, politics, and tourism. Tourism needs a beautiful object. Politics needs a strong symbol. History needs accuracy. But when a symbol becomes too useful, accuracy is often pushed aside. The viewer is shown stone and told, "Here is antiquity." And the viewer rarely asks how many times this stone was relaid, what stood here before repairs, and which layer he is actually looking at now. Badaling is too convenient not to raise suspicion. It is close to Beijing. It is dramatically located. It offers perfect panoramas. It can easily be turned into a mandatory stop on any route. It can be shown to foreign guests, school children, television cameras, tourists, and official delegations. Such a section does not simply exist. It works as a state showcase. And a showcase, as everyone knows, always looks better than the storeroom. But that is exactly the trap. The more beautifully an object works as a showcase, the more carefully we must treat the story of its origin. A ceremonial appearance does not prove antiquity. Good preservation does not prove a continuous defensive function. Tourist popularity does not prove historical clarity. Sometimes it is the opposite. The more actively an object is polished for the public, the harder it becomes to see what existed before the polishing. This applies to those fragments of Badaling where the restored line gradually turns into the less maintained part. It is especially important to look at the transition from ceremonial antiquity to the real condition of the wall. If even the abandoned section does not look convincingly ancient, then the question cannot be closed with a reference to repairs under Mao Zedong. Repairs explain the shine, but they do not explain the mystery of origin. And here the main question returns again. Who built this section and when? If it truly arose in deep antiquity, why does its condition raise so many suspicions? If it was a later Manchu structure, why was it so easily written into the grand legend of the Great Wall? If it was actively restored in the 20th century, where is the boundary between genuine antiquity, later masonry, and the political reconstruction of an image? There is no answer that removes all questions. Instead, there is a convenient picture: a stone wall on a mountain ridge, towers, battlements, tourists, and words about thousand-year-old defense. But underneath that picture lies a harsh problem. The most famous section looks too good, too useful, and too fresh for an object that is supposed to carry the weight of a vast, ancient history. And if somewhere beyond the tourist route the wall still does not seem truly ancient, then this is not a minor complaint, but a serious blow to the familiar image. Badaling may be restored, decorated, renewed, strengthened, and turned into a symbol. But a symbol is not proof. Stone may remain silent, but its appearance sometimes screams louder than any chronicle. That is why Badaling looks not only like a landmark, but like a suspect in a confrontation with history. It is shown as the face of the ancient wall, but its freshness, restoration, and strange preservation force the same question again and again. Perhaps before us is not simply an old frontier that survived the centuries. Perhaps before us is a late construction of an image where stone, repair, and state legend have been welded together so tightly that it has become almost impossible to separate one from the other. And after all of this, what remains is not a majestic postcard, but an uncomfortable protocol of questions. Who built the mountain section of Badaling? When exactly did it appear in the form that was later turned into the face of the Great Wall of China? And most importantly, why was it necessary to raise such a heavy stone line where the mountains themselves already worked as a natural fortress? The simple version about tourism falls apart immediately. In the 19th century, there was no mass tourist cult around Chinese antiquities in the modern sense. No one would have driven workers onto the ridges, dragged stone upward, raised towers, and laid lines across the peaks only for future excursions, postcards, and photographs. Tourist fame could come later, but it does not explain the original order to build. This applies to the bluntest fact. The wall could not have been created from the start as a decoration for visitors. It became a decoration later, when the section proved convenient, spectacular, and close to Beijing. But the origin of the structure must be searched for, not in ticket offices and travel brochures, but in politics, borders, fears, and the ambitions of power. The defensive version also fails to close the question. If we were talking about a valley, a road, a plain, or an important passage, everything would look more understandable. But before us are mountains, ridges, heavy climbs, and natural obstacles. There is no need to build a continuous stone wall on every crest to understand that enemy movement there would already be slow, difficult, and predictable. Towers, outposts, fortified points, and control over the passes would have been enough. That is why the phrase, "the wall protected China from nomads," sounds here not like an answer, but like a screen. From which specific units? Along which exact route? Why did they have to be stopped, not at convenient passages, but along a long line in the mountains? Why did the construction turn out so demonstrative, so heavy, and so theatrical? Too much stone for too weak an explanation. This also applies to the version of a simple border. An earthen rampart on a plain could mark a boundary between states. It could be a rough signature of power on the land. But a mountain ridge is already a border, visible, harsh, and natural. If a disputed place needed to be marked, a tower or an outpost would have been enough. If control needed to be shown, a fortress on a pass would have been enough. But here, an entire wall appears, as if power wanted not simply to draw a line, but to stamp it into the mind. Then a more cutting version remains. Badaling may have been a later structure, or a later shaped symbol connected with the era of Manchu rule. The Qing dynasty received China after 1644, during a period of heavy restructuring, internal fractures, and the struggle to control a vast territory. Such power needed not only armies and officials, it needed signs. Stone, loud, visible signs that showed, the north is under control, Beijing is covered, and the border has a master. One thing is clear. If Badaling was built or seriously shaped in a later period, it no longer fits into the schoolbook formula about an ancient wall against steppe raids. Then it becomes part of a completely different story. A story of power creating an image of order, strength, and historical depth. In that case, stone worked not only as a barrier, but as a statement. Not only for enemies, but for its own subjects. This applies to the possible European trace in the architectural logic. The original version directly suggests that similar walls from the history of civilized Europe may have served as a model. This does not mean that Badaling should immediately be declared a European construction, but the thought itself is disturbing. If the architectural language of the section does not look purely ancient and self-contained, then the question of time and influence becomes even sharper. Another thing is clear: the famous tourist image cannot be proof of antiquity. The restored section under Mao Zedong, the neat walkways, the renewed walls, the convenient routes, and the spectacular views create a powerful image. But image is not origin. An ancient ruin can be restored, a later wall can be renewed, a disputed object can be turned into a national icon. But a stone showcase does not answer what exactly stood here before, and why. That is why the final question remains open and angry. Who exactly ordered this section to be built? Which documents confirm it? Why was there so little clarity around the mountain part of the wall before the beginning of the 20th century? Why does the object now shown as a symbol of ancient defense look as if its real biography may be far shorter and much murkier than the official legend? This does not apply to denying the Great Wall of China as a historical phenomenon. Walls, ramparts, towers, and borderlines really did exist. The question is different. Can all of this be folded into one shining legend without checking, without separating periods, without analyzing a specific section? Can Badaling honestly be called the face of thousand-year defense if its purpose, preservation, and late fame raise so many uncomfortable questions? It is clear that the tourism version is weak. It is clear that a purely defensive explanation cannot withstand the pressure of the landscape. It is clear that simple border logic does not save the situation either. It is clear that the Manchu period and the later modernization of China provide a much harsher context. But the main thing is still unclear. Why exactly was this wall built in the mountains? And as long as there is no honest answer to that question, Badaling remains not just a landmark, but a stone accusation against the familiar version. It can be photographed, restored, included in routes, shown to delegations and schoolchildren. But the more it is turned into an unquestionable symbol, the more visible the main crack becomes. The most famous section of the Great Wall of China may be the most uncomfortable one for official history. Perhaps someday documents, archaeology, and an honest analysis of the layers will give a precise answer. But today, before us stands not a closed page, but a heavy stone question. Not simply, how was it built? Not simply, who guarded it? But the most dangerous question for any beautiful legend. Why was it built exactly here, exactly this way, and exactly then, when nature itself had already done everything a wall was supposed to do? And what do you think? Was Badaling truly an ancient defensive frontier? Or are we looking at a later stone symbol that was too conveniently written into the grand legend of the Great Wall of China? Write in the comments which version seems most convincing to you. Because in this story, one question still sounds louder than all the others. Why build a wall where nature itself was already a wall? If you found this episode interesting, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations from the archive of uncomfortable facts. And make sure to press the bell icon so the next videos don't get lost in your feed. We will continue uncovering stories where the official answers are too smooth and the real questions are too dangerous to stay silent about.